Rotterdam, 15 March 1944. A man in a filthy overcoat leans against a lamppost on a canal-side street, reeking of cheap tobacco and worse gin, watching a doorway with the patience of someone who has done this before. Across the water, a German officer steps out of a requisitioned townhouse, straightens his cap, and begins his short walk to a waiting staff car. He never reaches it. The man in the overcoat closes the distance in a dozen unhurried steps, raises what looks, at a glance, like a length of plumbing pipe, and presses it into the small of the officer's back. There is no crack of gunfire. There is a sound closer to a bicycle pump than a pistol, a soft cough of escaping gas, barely audible over the wash of the canal. The officer folds to the pavement. By the time anyone in the street has turned to look, the man in the overcoat has already rounded the corner, and the strange pipe has vanished back inside his coat. This is not fiction. Encounters like it, though scattered and thinly documented, happened across occupied Europe between 1943 and 1945, and the weapon at the center of them was real, built for exactly this purpose in the English countryside, by a government that officially denied its own capacity for assassination. It was called the well rod, and it remains, by the testimony of the men who built it and the historians who have studied it since, one of the quietest firearms ever produced. To understand why Britain built a gun that sounded less like a weapon than a household appliance, you first have to understand a problem that conventional firearms simply could not solve. By 1942, Britain's Special Operations Executive had a difficulty that no amount of raw firepower could fix. Its agents and the resistance networks it supplied across Denmark, France, Holland, and further afield were operating in the most dangerous possible circumstances. Unarmed populations under military occupation, where the discovery of a single firearm could mean the execution of an entire household, and where the sound of a gunshot in a quiet street or a rural lane carried for hundreds of meters and brought a German patrol running within minutes. Conventional pistols, even the compact ones favored by intelligence services, produced a report loud enough to be heard through walls and across water. Improvised suppressors fitted to standard service pistols helped, but not much. Most reduced the muzzle blast only marginally, and none addressed the mechanical clatter of a semi-automatic action cycling a fresh round, which itself could give away a position in a silent building. The tactical need was narrow but absolute. A weapon that could kill a sentry, a collaborator, or a marked officer at conversational distance in a single shot, without alerting anyone more than a few paces away, and that could then disappear back into a coat pocket or a tool bag without arousing suspicion if searched. Nothing in any nation's standard arsenal came close. The Germans had suppressed variants of the Sauer 38H and other pocket pistols in limited circulation, largely for their own intelligence services, but these remained semi-automatic weapons with the associated mechanical noise and were never issued at scale to resistance movements, for the obvious reason that Berlin had no interest in arming the people it occupied. For SOE, the absence of a purpose-built silent weapon was not a matter of inconvenience. Agents were being captured, tortured, and shot because they lacked the means to remove a threat quietly, and resistance cells were being unraveled because sabotage operations kept alerting guards who conventional weapons could not silence in time. There was also a political dimension to the problem, one that rarely made it into the training manuals but shaped every decision Station 9 made. Britain could not be seen, officially, to be arming European civilians for the purpose of killing enemy personnel outside the recognized laws of war. Any weapon issued to a resistance network had to be deniable twice over. Deniable in the sense that its user could plausibly claim, if caught unarmed, to have no connection to violence at all, and deniable in the sense that the weapon itself, if recovered, could not be traced back to a British factory or a British designer. A standard-issue revolver failed both tests. It was unmistakably a weapon of war, loud enough to draw a crowd, and stamped, however discreetly, with markings that identified its origin. The organization needed something that did not yet exist anywhere in the world. A firearm engineered from first principles for silence and secrecy rather than firepower, cheap enough to produce in the thousands, simple enough that a teenage farmhand in occupied Denmark could be trained to use it in an afternoon, and anonymous enough that it revealed nothing about where it had come from, even under close enemy inspection. No general issue sidearm from any combatant nation was built with those priorities in mind, because no regular army had ever needed to solve that particular problem before. The answer came from a nondescript country house near Welwyn Garden City in Hertfordshire, requisitioned by SOE and designated Station 9. Officially, it was the Inter-Services Research Bureau, and its output over the course of the war ranged from folding motorcycles to limpet mines, but its guiding principle was consistent. Whatever it built had to work for people with no formal military training, operating alone, with no support if things went wrong. Every device to emerge from the site carried a name beginning with the syllable well after the town itself, and the credit for what became the most notorious of them fell to an engineer named Major Hugh Reeves, who worked under the deliberately unmemorable cover name Major Dolphin. Development began in the second half of 1942, and the design that emerged rejected almost every convention of pistol engineering in pursuit of a single goal. The finished weapon, designated the well rod, took the form of a plain steel tube roughly 12 inches long and just over an inch in diameter, weighing about 1.2 kilograms, with no visible trigger guard, no external hammer, and nothing resembling the silhouette people expect from a handgun. A rotary bolt handle protruded from the rear, operated by hand for every single shot, because Reeves and his team had concluded that an automatic or semi-automatic action was fundamentally incompatible with true silence. The clack of a slide or bolt cycling was, in a quiet street at night, almost as revealing as the shot itself. The barrel itself was drilled with 16 to 20 small ports along its length, which bled propellant gas away gradually rather than allowing it to escape in one sharp burst at the muzzle, and which had the useful secondary effect of slowing the bullet below the speed of sound, since a supersonic round produces its own miniature sonic crack regardless of what happens at the barrel. That gas was then routed into an integral suppressor built into the same tube, containing as many as 18 metal baffles interspersed with thick rubber wipes that further absorbed and delayed the escaping gas. The rubber wipes wore out quickly, perforated by the first shot alone, and good for perhaps 10 rounds before they needed replacing, a maintenance detail that mattered little for a weapon typically intended to fire once. The magazine, holding either 6 rounds of 9mm or 8 of the smaller .32 caliber depending on the version, doubled as the pistol's grip and could be pulled free entirely, at which point the tube looked so unlike a firearm that resistance fighters nicknamed it the bicycle pump, a comparison sound engineers who later tested surviving examples found strangely apt. One technician who examined a refurbished well rod decades later described its report as quieter than a child's air pistol, audible only as a soft hiss at a distance of a few meters. Just how quiet the finished weapon actually was became something of a point of pride and later a point of curiosity for firearms historians decades after the war ended. Wartime measurements taken with the comparatively crude sound testing equipment of the period put the report at around 73 decibels, quieter than an ordinary conversation held a few feet away. When enthusiasts revisited a fully refurbished example with modern equipment in 2002, they recorded a final figure closer to 123 decibels, but the more meaningful number was the reduction achieved compared with an unsuppressed pistol of equivalent barrel length, a drop of some 34 decibels, among the largest such reductions ever measured on a firearm of the period. One tester who handled a restored well rod years later described its report as quieter than a compressed gas pellet pistol, a comparison that says a great deal about a weapon originally built to kill. In practical terms, at a range of only a few meters in a quiet street, the sound was reported to be barely perceptible, and in anything louder than complete silence, such as a working dockside or a crowded room, it would very likely not have been heard at all by anyone beyond arm's reach. Every well rod left the factory without a single manufacturer's mark, stamped only with a serial number and a handful of inscrutable symbols, a deliberate policy to ensure that if one were ever recovered by the enemy, it could never be traced back to its country of origin, let alone to the quiet house outside Welwyn where it had been designed. Production began in 1943 at the Birmingham Small Arms Company, a firm better known for building conventional service rifles, by the 100,000, with later batches spread across other English works to avoid concentrating output and therefore risk in a single location. Exact wartime output remains uncertain to this day. Historians generally place wartime manufacture at around 2,800 units, with total production, including post-war orders placed once the weapon's reputation had spread to other Western intelligence services, estimated at somewhere near 14,000. Those figures remain approximate for a simple reason. So much of the paperwork documenting Station 9's output was itself treated as classified material, and much of it was destroyed, dispersed, or simply never filed in a form that survived the decades since. Getting the weapon into the right hands was almost as demanding as building it. From the middle of 1943 onward, well rods were parachuted into occupied territory alongside explosives, radios, and other supplies, reaching resistance networks that stretched from Denmark and France to Albania and even parts of occupied Manchuria, wherever SOE or its American counterpart, the Office of Strategic Services, maintained contact with local fighters. Surviving accounts, though sparse and often secondhand, describe its use against exactly the targets it was designed for. Guards posted at bridges and rail junctions during sabotage operations, and individual Gestapo officers or collaborators marked for removal by resistance cells who could not risk a gunfight. One account, passed down through French resistance circles, describes an operative shooting a suspected informer inside a crowded bar and walking out through the same room moments later without anyone realizing a shot had been fired at all. In 1943, planners in London went further still, drawing up a scheme to distribute large numbers of well rods across occupied Europe for a coordinated month-long campaign of assassinations targeting SS and Gestapo personnel. The scale of the plan was never matched by what actually happened on the ground, and how much of it was carried out, if any of it was, is simply not recorded in any archive that has surfaced. That gap is characteristic of the weapon's entire operational history. Because success meant leaving no trace and no witnesses, the well rod's real combat record is almost certainly far larger than what survives on paper, and no historian claims otherwise with confidence. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing but a tap. Germany, for all its wartime engineering, never fielded anything comparable at scale. Its suppressed pistols, adaptations of existing semi-automatic designs like the Sauer 38H, remained mechanically noisy compared with the well rod's single bolt action, and more importantly, were never issued to resistance or partisan forces, since Berlin had no partisans of its own to arm. The comparison that mattered more, in practical terms, was with the Americans. The OSS acquired a well rod directly and had it tested at the Washington Navy Yard's Naval Gun Factory over the summer of 1943, alongside its own suppressed .22 caliber high-standard pistol. American evaluators concluded, with some reluctance, that the British design was simply better for the job and declined to develop a domestic rival, instead adopting the well rod outright under the deliberately bland designation hand-firing device Mark I, and later arranging limited production of their own through a contractor in Texas. The high-standard pistol had its uses, being semi-automatic and therefore faster to fire a second shot, but its smaller .22 round carried noticeably less stopping power at close range, and its slide still made noise the well rod's bolt action avoided almost entirely. In the narrow, brutal category the well rod occupied, a single, silent, certain shot against an unsuspecting target, nothing else built during the Second World War, on either side, matched it. What the Welrod actually achieved in material terms is almost impossible to quantify, and any honest account has to admit that. It did not sink ships or destroy bridges. Its effect was measured one life at a time in men who never got the chance to raise an alarm. Its real legacy is harder to see and arguably more significant. It proved that a weapon engineered purely around the demands of clandestine operation, rather than around conventional battlefield performance, was not only viable, but decisive within its narrow role, and that principle shaped covert weapon design for the rest of the century. The Welrod itself far outlived the war that produced it, remaining in limited service with British Special Forces and, through the CIA, American operatives for decades afterward, reportedly seeing use in Korea, Malaya, Northern Ireland, and even the Falklands Campaign of 1982, a service life stretching across nearly 40 years for a weapon designed in a few frantic months in 1942. Surviving examples can today be seen in the Royal Armouries collection and in several military museums in Britain and the United States, plain steel tubes behind glass that give almost no hint to the untrained eye of what they once did. Its influence persists even now. Modern suppressed pistols built for specialist military and law enforcement units decades after Reeves's death are still routinely compared to his original design, evidence of just how completely he solved the problem he was given. Return for a moment to that street in Rotterdam, to the man in the overcoat and the officer who never reached his car. Multiply that single scene by however many others like it took place in doorways and back lanes across occupied Europe, scenes that were never written down because writing them down was itself a danger, and you begin to understand what the Welrod actually was. It was not a weapon built to win battles in the way a tank or a bomber wins battles, by mass and force applied at scale. It was built to solve a much narrower and much stranger problem. How do you fight an occupying army when raising your voice, let alone a gun, could get your entire street shot in reprisal by morning? Most weapons of the Second World War were designed to be seen and feared. The Welrod was designed to do the opposite, to achieve its purpose and then vanish, leaving behind no bang, no smoke, no shell casing rolling across cobblestones, nothing but a body and a silence that gave its user the time to walk calmly away. Hugh Reeves and his colleagues at a requisitioned house outside Welwyn answered that problem with 18 rubber and metal baffles, a hand-cycled bolt, and a length of unmarked steel tube that looked, when it needed to, like nothing more dangerous than a length of household plumbing or a bicycle pump left leaning against a wall. It was a strange, almost anti-heroic piece of engineering, a gun built to be forgettable, and it succeeded so completely at that ambition that its own history has become one of the hardest in British military archives to pin down. There is no tally of confirmed kills, no official after-action report listing dates and names, because a weapon that worked exactly as intended left almost nothing behind for historians to find. What survives instead is fragments, a serial number in a museum case, a handful of resistance testimonies passed down by families, a Navy Yard evaluation report from the summer of 1943, and the plain fact that intelligence agencies on both sides of the Atlantic kept quietly ordering more of them for 40 years after the war that produced it had ended. That persistence is, in its own way, the clearest evidence of how well the design worked. Weapons that fail get abandoned. Weapons that succeed get copied, refined, and kept in service long after the conflict that justified their creation has faded into history books. And the Welrod was still being issued to British and American operatives when the Falklands Campaign began in 1982, 4 decades after Reeves first sketched its outline in a converted country house. Consider what that means. A piece of equipment built in a matter of months, under wartime pressure, by a small team working in near-total secrecy, remained the benchmark for silent, close-quarters killing for longer than most nations' entire standard-issue sidearms stay in frontline service. It was quiet by design, and it was forgotten by that same design, its true tally of use lost in the same silence it was built to create. That, in the end, is the whole story of the well rod. A weapon engineered so successfully for secrecy that its greatest achievement is a history no one can ever fully tell. Somewhere in occupied Europe, in a moment nobody wrote down and nobody was ever meant to know about, it did exactly what it was built to do, and then it disappeared just as it was designed to.